Elena stepped out of the car, and the sweltering heat of Monte Velluto immediately descended upon her shoulders, heavy and spiced, like an old brocade blanket. Before her stood Villa Alba, a once majestic ancestral nest that now seemed a mere ghost of its former opulence. Tall cypresses, like faithful sentinels, lined the driveway, their peaks motionless in the windless air, pointing toward a cloudless cobalt sky. She slowly ran her palm along the faded metal of the gates. The paint flaked away beneath her fingers, revealing rust that smelled of iron and time. The silence here was almost tangible, broken only by the dry chirping of cicadas, which merged into a single, vibrating hum emanating from the very earth itself. Step by step, she ventured deeper into her new domain, feeling the slender heels of her city shoes sink into the parched, cracked soil, a ground as desperate for rain as this estate was for human warmth. Having ascended to the terrace, Elena turned around. From this vantage point, the valley unfolded in all its daunting and beautiful majesty. Endless rows of vineyards stretched toward the horizon, resembling neat stitches upon the body of the earth. Yet her plot looked different. Here, the vines were tangled in a chaotic knot, feral and overgrown with weeds, pleading for the hand of a master. A thick aroma drifted through the air-heated pine needles, dried lavender, and something else, the elusive scent of a dusty history that now belonged to her alone. She drew a heavy, wrought iron key from her handbag, its coldness in her palm momentarily steadying her. Inserting it into the keyhole of the massive oak door, Elena hesitated. Behind this door lay the end of her accustomed life in the metropolis, and the beginning of something she could not yet put into words, but already felt in her fingertips like the premonition of an electric discharge before a storm. The door yielded with a heavy, groaning sigh. Inside Villa Alba, a soft twilight reigned, filled with dust motes dancing in sparse shafts of light. Elena pulled the white covers off the armchairs, and a cloud rose into the air, smelling of an old library and beeswax. She approached the window and, with an effort, pushed open the shutters. Light flooded inside, blinding her, and in that sudden radiance, she saw him for the first time. On the neighboring hill, where the lands of Casa di Pietra began, stood a man. He was far away, but the translucent Tuscan air made his silhouette hauntingly distinct. Marco was working in the field, his movements methodical and powerful, like the very rhythm of nature itself. For a moment, he straightened, wiping his brow with his forearm, and seemed to look directly at her windows. Elena instinctively stepped back into the shadows, her heart skipping a beat. Between their houses lay only a shallow ravine overgrown with wild grapes. Yet at that moment, it felt as though a vast chasm of meaning separated them, one she was only beginning to cross. She watched him for a few more minutes, mesmerized by the way his tanned skin glistened in the sun. Marco moved with the grace of a predator, confident in his territory. And in every gesture, one could read an unwavering bond with this land. Elena looked at her own hands, delicate, urban, having known nothing heavier than a folder of documents, and felt a strange sense of defiance. She had come here not merely to possess a house, but to find herself anew. Kicking off her shoes onto the terracotta floor, she felt its cool, firm texture and smiled. Evening in Monte Velluto slowly bled into twilight, painting the walls of the house in the color of a ripe peach. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of an engine was heard. Marco was finishing his work. The first day of her new life was fading, leaving behind an aftertaste of tart grapes and the stirring realization that she was no longer alone. Elena spent her first night in a room that smelled of lavender and aged wood. Morning greeted her not with the din of the city, but with a deafening chorus of birds hidden within the dense canopies of the olive trees. Dressed in a light silk chemise, she stepped out onto the balcony and stood still. Below, in the hollow between the estates, a milky white mist swirled, from which the tops of the vines peered through like the masts of sunken ships. The air was damp and cool, brushing against her skin and leaving microscopic droplets of dew. Elena watched as the sun slowly crested the jagged horizon, tinting the fog in hues of rose gold. In that moment, the world felt primordial, created for her alone until the silence was pierced by the low, vibrating hum of a diesel engine. It was Marco. In his old SUV coated in russet dust, he was patrolling the borders of his domain, and Elena caught herself holding her breath as she followed the plume of dust trailing behind his vehicle. During the day, she decided to venture for the first time to the far edge of her plot, where the abandoned vines of Villa Alba grew close to the perfect, well-tended rows of Casa di Pietra. She wore a simple white shirt, knotted at the waist, and short shorts that revealed her long legs. The closer she drew to the boundary, the more intensely she smelled the heated earth and the bitter aroma of weeds. Suddenly, she saw him. Marco stood at the edge of his territory, leaning on a massive shovel. He was shirtless, wearing only dark work trousers. His back, broad and sculptural, glistened with sweat, and cords of muscle rippled beneath his skin. He did not hear her footsteps upon the soft grass, giving Elena the chance to observe him. The tattoo on his forearm, resembling a map of ancient roads, and the quiet confidence with which his large palms gripped the handle of his tool. When he turned around, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Marco did not smile, nor did he nod. He simply froze, caught off guard by this fragile, luminous figure framed against the backdrop of his rugged domain. His gaze, heavy and scrutinizing, swept across her face, lingered on the unfastened button of her shirt, and descended to her bare feet. Elena felt a wave of heat surge through her body, one that had nothing to do with the Tuscan sun. No more than 10 meters lay between them, yet the air in that space instantly grew dense, electrified. Marco slowly drove the shovel into the earth and, drawing a flask from his back pocket, took a long swallow, never once breaking eye contact. A drop of water escaped, rolling down his chin and onto his chest, disappearing into the hollow between his pectoral muscles. Neither of them uttered a word, but in that silence rang the acknowledgement of an inevitable collision between two different worlds. The following morning, Elena decided she would not let the estate dictate its own terms. In the shed, she unearthed an old pair of garden shears, heavy and encrusted with patina, and set to work. The thorny branches of wild briar scratched her delicate hands, and the sun beat mercilessly down on the nape of her neck. Yet with a certain frenzy, she continued to prune away the excess, exposing the skeletal frames of the grapevines. She wanted to prove above all to herself that she was capable of taming this chaos. By midday, her palms burned with blisters, and her white shirt was stained with patches of sap and dust. She paused to catch her breath and saw Marco. He was standing on his side, leaning against a stone fence post, silently observing her clumsy yet desperate movements. There was no mockery in his eyes, rather, a strange, almost painful curiosity. He approached the low stone masonry that divided their plots. Now only 2 paces separated them. Marco reached out and touched one of the branches she had cut, lying upon the stones. His fingers, darkened by the earth, looked incredibly powerful beside her slender hands, which trembled with fatigue. He lifted his gaze to Elena. In his eyes, the sky of Monte Velluto was reflected, but deep within his pupils lurked something dark and elemental. He pointed to her shears, then to his own hands, gesturing that she was holding the tool incorrectly. Without uttering a single word, he stepped over the low fence, crossing onto her land. Elena instinctively recoiled, feeling herself enveloped by his scent, a mixture of tobacco, musk, and fresh grapevine leaves. It was an invasion, silent and commanding, one that she neither wanted nor could bring herself to stop. Marco approached her from behind. She felt the heat radiating from his body an instant before his hand came to rest over hers, which was still gripping the shears. His fingers were firm and warm, completely enveloping her hand to guide its movement. Elena froze, afraid to move a muscle. The back of her head was only a few centimeters from his chest, and she could hear his steady, deep breathing. He applied pressure, and the blades easily snapped through a thick branch. His proximity was overwhelming, stripping her of her will and making her forget the ache in her muscles in the scorching sun. He released her hand as abruptly as he had taken it, and without looking back, returned to his own land. Elena remained standing among the severed branches, feeling the invisible trail of his touch upon her skin, a sensation that burned more intensely than any sunburn. Evening brought a chill, but within her, a fire was already igniting, one that no Tuscan wind could ever extinguish. By the end of the week, the sky over Monte Velluto had filled with a leaden heaviness. The air grew so thick, it felt as though it could be sliced with a knife. Elena was working on the terrace, sifting through her grandfather's old records, when the first heavy drops of rain struck the scorched tiles, kicking up plumes of steam. In an instant, the heavens tore open, transforming the valley into a solid gray wall of water. Remembering the open windows in the far wing, where the most precious young saplings were kept, she dashed down. The rain soaked through her dress in a heartbeat. It clung to her body like a second skin, emphasizing every curve. She was struggling with the heavy door of the outbuilding when Marco's figure emerged from the veil of the downpour. He was running toward her, his undershirt plastered to his powerful torso, his hair slicked back to reveal a brow that made his gaze even more piercing. He burst into the room behind her, slamming the door shut with force and cutting off the roar of the elements. Inside, a dim twilight took hold, filled with the scent of damp earth and ozone. They stood there, breathing heavily, eyes locked on one another. Water cascaded from Elena's hair, tracing paths along her collarbones and disappearing into the deep neckline of her dress. Marco took a step forward. In the cramped space of the wing, amidst crates of soil and young shoots, his presence felt overwhelming. He reached out and slowly, with the tips of his fingers, tucked a wet lock of hair away from her face. His touch was hauntingly gentle for such a powerful man. He lingered with his hand against her cheek, and Elena felt her own resistance dissolve, turning into a thick, sweet languor. She did not look away, accepting this silent challenge, this unspoken pact signed between them in the roar of the rain. Outside, thunder rumbled, shaking the ancient walls of Villa Alba. But here, in the stillness of the outbuilding, the only sound was the thrumming of their hearts. Marco leaned toward her, his face coming within inches of hers. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her lips. In this moment, there was no room for names, status, or the past. There was only a primal chemistry, the very kind that forces grapes to swell with juice under a scorching sun. He did not kiss her. No. He merely pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as if trying to memorize this moment. The scent of her skin mingled with the fragrance of the rain. As the downpour began to subside, he departed just as silently, dissolving into the gray haze and leaving Elena surrounded by the aromas of the earth and an awakening passion that had now become her greatest secret. August draped Tuscany in a golden haze, within which the outlines of the hills trembled. It was the time of the ripening of silence, when even the birds grew still, hiding in the silvery foliage of the olives. Elena had learned to live by the rhythm of this land. An early rise, work until the sun began to sear, and long hours of midday torpor. On one such day, when the air inside the house became too stagnant, she stepped out onto the terrace with a bowl of ice-cold peaches. Through half-closed eyelids, she watched Casa di Pietra. On that side of the ravine, life did not pause for a second. Marco, it seemed, was forged from the same flint as the walls of his home. He did not fear the heat. She saw him repairing an old stone terrace, his powerful hands lifting heavy boulders as if they were made of papier-mâché. Elena took a peach, and its juice, sweet and sticky, flowed over her fingers. She did not wipe it away, but allowed a drop to glide down her wrist to her elbow. Feeling Marco's gaze, she was certain he was watching, literally burning through the distance that separated them. She stood up, walked to the very edge of the balustrade, and, stretching slowly, tilted her face toward the sun. The thin fabric of her sundress was nearly translucent in this merciless light. It was a game without rules, a dance at a distance where every movement held significance. She saw Marco stop, saw him slowly lower a stone to the ground, and straighten up, his eyes never leaving her. His silhouette against the backdrop of parched grass seemed carved from dark wood. In that moment, a bond was forged between them, more enduring than any words. Marco took a bottle of water and, looking directly at Elena, tipped it over himself. Streams of water washed over his head and shoulders, cascading down the sculpted muscles of his abdomen and disappearing behind the waistband of his trousers. This was his response, just as bold and undisguised. Elena felt her throat go dry. In this midday heat, where all living things sought the shade, their mutual attraction only grew, becoming almost tangible, like the shimmering of the air over a sun-baked road. When he finally turned away and vanished into the cool darkness of his house, Elena realized that this siege could not last forever. A week passed before Marco made his next move. Elena found a basket woven from willow twigs on her doorstep. There was no note, only a heavy cluster of dark, almost black Sangiovese grapes and a heavy brass key with a wooden tag, upon which the number 7 had been branded. It was not merely a gift. It was a silent challenge, an invitation into the inner sanctum of his domain, the ancient cellars of Casa di Pietra. Elena's heart beat in an uneven rhythm. She chose her simplest dress black, with thin straps that emphasized the porcelain whiteness of her shoulders, and, as the shadows began to lengthen, she made her way toward her neighbor's house. The path to the cellar led downward, into the very heart of the hill. No sooner had she crossed the threshold than the Tuscan heat vanished, replaced by a blessed coolness smelling of damp earth and aged wine. At the end of a long corridor, illuminated only by sparse torches in wrought iron holders, she saw Marco. He stood by a massive oak barrel, holding a slender glass wine thief. The firelight played across his cheekbones, casting deep shadows. Silently, he motioned her toward a high stool at a rough wooden table, where 2 glasses already stood. The air here was so thick with the aromas of fermentation, oak, and earth that Elena's head began to swim. Marco filled the glasses. The wine was young and bold, the color of Venus blood. He approached her and held out a glass. When their fingers touched, it was as if an electric discharge surged through the room. Marco did not let go of the glass, forcing her to look him in the eyes. In this silence, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep in the cellar, he slowly raised his free hand and touched the rim of her glass, and then her lower lip, smearing an invisible drop of wine. It was a movement full of possessiveness and tenderness all at once. Elena took a sip, feeling the tart, astringent taste on her tongue, and saw a dark flame ignite in Marco's eyes. Here, under the protection of the stone vaults, their intimacy became as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. The harvest had begun a time when all of Montevelluto transformed into a single living organism. Elena worked alongside the others on her plots, which Marco had helped her restore by sending his finest laborers. But she was no longer a mere bystander. She cut the heavy clusters herself, feeling the sticky sap coat her hands, while the scent of crushed berries intoxicated her mind. By evening, as the sun touched the horizon, the work shifted toward the great vats for pressing. According to ancient tradition, the first batch of grapes was to be crushed under the bare feet of those who owned the land. Marco stood in a massive wooden vat, knee-deep in a violet mass. He extended a hand to Elena, helping her climb up. She kicked off her sandals and stepped inside. The cool, slippery pulp of the berries beneath her feet drew an involuntary gasp from her. Marco took her by the waist, helping her maintain her balance. They began to move in a rhythm set by life itself, up and down, crushing the fruit, releasing its essence. His hands on her waist were burning, and his fingers slightly tightened against the fabric of her dress. Around them, people laughed and music played, but for Elena, all of it blurred into a distant background. As twilight deepened, the first lanterns were lit over the vineyards. Marco drew her closer until their breath became one. His face was splattered with juice, giving him the appearance of an ancient deity descended from a fresco. In this ritual dance upon the grapes, there was no room for doubt. All the passion they had hoarded through long weeks of glances across the boundary was now concentrated in this physical exertion, in this close contact of their bodies. When they finally stepped out of the vat, Marco did not let her go. He led her away from the festive clamor, toward the place where, beyond the rows of vines, the old olive grove began, submerged in the silvery silence of the moonlight. The silvery foliage of the olives in the moonlight resembled a frozen sea, its waves whispering of secrets accumulated over centuries. Elena followed Marco, feeling the dry grass tickle her ankles, which still bore the faint traces of grape juice. Here, far from the festive bonfires and the laughter of the workers, the air was different. It was steeped in the scent of night jasmine and cooling stone. Marco stopped by the oldest tree, whose twisted, gnarled branches resembled the arms of an ancient titan. He turned around, and in the flickering moonlight, his face appeared as if cast in bronze. Elena saw his chest, heaving heavily after the long day's labor, and in his gaze, now stripped of its daytime austerity, emerged an undisguised, hungry adoration. He made no move toward her. He waited, allowing her to decide for herself if she was ready to cross the final invisible line that still separated them in this boundless Tuscan night. Elena took that step, and the world around them instantly narrowed to the span of their breath. She reached out, and her fingers brushed the tattoo on his forearm. The skin beneath the ink was hot, and she felt a muscle quiver under her palm. Marco slowly covered her hand with his own, pressing Elena's palm against his chest, right where his heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm, like the strikes of a hammer against an anvil. In this gesture, there was so much unspoken confession, so much thirst accumulated over the summer that Elena's breath hitched. She lifted her eyes and saw his pupils dilate, swallowing the light of his irises. His other hand came to rest on the nape of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair, which smelled of the sun and the valley wind. Time stopped, frozen in anticipation, until the silence of the grove became almost unbearable, filled with the electricity of a proximity that no longer required words or justifications. He leaned toward her slowly, and his lips touched her neck for the first time, a fleeting, almost weightless graze that sent a shiver through Elena's body, forcing her to press even closer to him. Marco inhaled the scent of her skin as if trying to sate himself for a lifetime, while his hands explored the curves of her back, memorizing every line through the thin fabric of her dress. It was an exploration full of reverence and, at the same time, a primal passion that had lain dormant in them both since their first meeting at the edge of their lands. Around them, the cicadas continued their rhythmic chirping, and somewhere in the distance, the echoes of the festival could still be heard, but here, beneath the canopy of the olives, they were the only living beings in the universe. Elena tilted her head back, surrendering her face to his caresses, and felt her former life finally dissolve into this night, giving way to something vast and inevitable, like the dawn itself over Monte Velluto. Upon returning to Villa Alba, they found the house transformed by the light of the night. Elena lit candles on the terrace, and their flickering flames began a whimsical dance across the ancient stone walls, pulling from the darkness the silhouette of an antique vase or the intricate patterns of the aged floor tiles. Marco brought a bottle of his finest wine, the very one kept in the furthest corner of the cellar for a special occasion. He opened it with one precise motion, and the aroma of seasoned oak and ripe cherry instantly filled the space between them. They sat opposite each other, the table appearing like a battlefield, where a truce had already been struck, though the terms were yet to be negotiated. The candlelight reflected in their glasses, casting ruby stains upon the tabletop like droplets of molten gemstone. Every movement Marco made, the way he brought the glass to his lips, the way he leaned back in his chair, was imbued with a hidden grace that held Elena hypnotized. She felt the wine spread through her body in a pleasant warmth, dissolving the last remnants of tension and sharpening her senses to their limit. The silence of the house, broken only by the crackling of the candles and the distant hoot of an owl, created an atmosphere of intimacy where every accidental brush of their knees under the table felt like a lightning strike. Elena stood up to trim the wick of one of the candles, and Marco rose as well, moving hauntingly close. He took her hand, his fingers slowly tracing the lines of her palm as if reading her destiny. In his gaze, there was no longer that distance he had so painstakingly maintained all summer. It was now the look of a man who had found what he had been seeking all his life, and had no intention of letting it go. The shadow of his powerful frame enveloped her, and in the twilight of the terrace, they seemed like a single entity, two shadows that had finally found a way to merge into one, defying all the laws of physics. Marco slowly drew her toward him, and Elena followed obediently, feeling his hands settle confidently upon her waist, pulling her against a body as firm as a rock. She placed her hands on his shoulders, sensing the coarse fabric of his shirt and the heat of his skin beneath her fingers. They began to move slowly to the beat of some internal music audible only to them, circling the terrace beneath the indifferent gaze of the stars. It was not a dance in the conventional sense, but rather a ritual of convergence, where every movement was intended to bring them even closer, to erase the final remnants of reserve and convention. The scent of his cologne, mingled with the aroma of wine and the night air, intoxicated her more powerfully than any vintage. When his lips finally found hers in their first true, lingering, and deep kiss, Elena realized that Villa Alba had at last found its master, and she had found her true homeland in the heart of this rugged and tender winemaker. Elena's room, bathed in the spectral glow of the moon, became a sanctuary where time finally relinquished its hold. The candles brought in from the terrace were flickering low in their bronze holders, casting soft, trembling shadows upon the high, vaulted ceilings. Marco stood before her, and in this twilight, his silhouette seemed part of the very architecture of the ancient villa, steadfast and eternal. When his hands touched her shoulders, Elena felt a surge of warmth wash over her, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cool Tuscan night. His palms, which knew the ruggedness of stone and the weight of the vine, caressed her skin with an unexpected, almost prayerful reverence. It was a silent confession, where every movement of his fingers supplanted 1,000 words. In the stillness, broken only by the rustle of the olives outside the window, they finally allowed the emotions they had gathered all summer to break free, transforming every gesture into an act of high art. The intimacy between them unfolded slowly, much like the bouquet of a complex wine revealing itself in a glass. In the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, their movements appeared as part of an ancient dance. Elena felt the heat radiating from Marco, his presence filling the entire space around her, leaving no room for doubt or the past. She explored his face with her fingertips, memorizing every line and every feature that had become so dear to her through months of silent observation. His hands, confident and tender, traced the contours of her body, as if he were rediscovering a beauty hidden beneath layers of silk and city polish. There was a remarkable harmony in this union. Marco's strength met Elena's grace, creating a oneness that felt as natural as the merging of two rivers in the valley. As the night reached its zenith, and the world beyond the room finally ceased to exist, their embrace became the anchor they had both subconsciously sought. There was no need for words when breath became shared, and the rhythm of their hearts merged into the single pulse of the earth. Marco held her as if she contained the entire meaning of his labors, the very essence of these vineyards and this sky. Elena felt both protected and profoundly free, like a bird that had at last found its home. In this moment, nothing was accidental. There was only the pure, wild, and beautiful attraction of two souls who had recognized one another among 1,000 others. When exhaustion and tenderness finally prevailed, they remained lying in the pre-dawn stillness, their hands and thoughts entwined, listening as the night fell asleep and a new day one that was now theirs together prepared to awaken. The first rays of the sun, filtering through the slits in the shutters, traced golden stripes across the bedroom floor. Elena woke first, feeling the heavy, warm weight of Marco's palm upon her shoulder. This morning, Monte Velluto looked different. The colors were more vivid, the scents sharper, and the silence brimmed with meaning. She carefully eased herself from his embrace and walked to the window, throwing the shutters wide to meet the cool morning air. The valley below was washed in dew, shimmering in the light of the rising sun. Looking at the rows of vineyards now, she no longer saw the boundaries between Villa Alba and Casa di Pietra. To her, it was a single land, living and breathing, ready to yield its finest fruit to those who truly loved it. She heard a movement behind her and felt Marco approach, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin atop her head. They stood on the balcony, two people whose union had been sealed not by vows, but by labor, patience, and a passion that had ripened beneath the Tuscan sky. Marco pointed toward the far slope, where the young vines had already begun to swell with strength. There was the pride of a master in his gesture, and the tenderness of a man in love. Elena covered his hand with her own, feeling a sense of calm and certainty flow from him into her. Much work lay ahead, restoring the old cellars, pruning the feral bushes, and preparing the earth for winter. But this work no longer felt like a heavy burden. It was the beginning of their journey together, where every day would be filled with the scent of the earth and the taste of the wine they would create as one. The city, with its noise and bustle, remained somewhere in another life, reduced to a hazy memory. Evening found them on the terrace, seated at the same stone table Marco had once placed in the shade of an ancient olive tree. They watched in silence as the sky over Monte Velluto turned every shade of violet and orange, heralding a long and warm autumn. Before them stood two glasses filled with ruby wine, and within this simple, still life lay their entire truth. Life in the vineyard had taught them the ultimate lesson. True passion, like fine wine, requires time, sun, and devotion. Elena smiled as she looked at Marco, and he returned her gaze with a look that glowed with the quiet joy of discovery. Their love story was only beginning, promising to be as long and deep as the roots of the oldest vines in this blessed valley, where every sunset is but a promise of a new, even more beautiful dawn.